land of my fathers.
Welcome to the book of Job. And what a book Job is. It's a book unlike any other book really in the Bible. And it begins with a description of Job's character. In verse 1 it says, Job was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. It sets the stage. Job is a God-fearing man, and he shuns evil, he is blameless, he is upright, no question. And then the opening verses then go on to describe how blessed Job is, how much God had blessed him. He had 7 sons, 3 daughters, thousands of cattle, and a lot of servants. He was a very blessed man indeed. He had God's attention because he was blameless and upright. But unfortunately, as this chapter also describes, he also got Satan's attention as well. And so the first chapter, it goes on then to explain how God allowed Satan to test Job, because God is determined to show that his servant Job is faithful and that his servant Job will not curse him to his face. And so it goes on then to describe the many losses of Job, the deaths of all of his children, the looting, stealing of all of his cattle. This is the handiwork of Satan. All that Satan, he's not allowed to touch his life. So, God allows that. But all that Satan leaves him with is his nagging wife, who tells him just to curse God and die. Yeah, you can see why maybe Satan left him. Part of his purpose. Jesus says in the New Testament that the devil comes to steal and kill and destroy. That is the handiwork of the devil, of Satan. And we could see it here in Job's life. Poor Job, what he went through. And so God allows this to happen. Satan destroys and kills much of all of his blessings. And in Job chapter 1 verse 21, Job says this. He says, after all of these losses, he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Wow. How many of us would praise the name of the Lord if we had lost something dear to us? Many of us blame God, don't we? And like I said, his nagging wife in Job chapter 2 verse 9 said, are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. She wishes him dead. What a wife. Not exactly the kind of words you want your partner to tell you when you go through the worst season in your life. But this book is profoundly deep and very helpful for when we go through very difficult circumstances in our lives. And of course, there are a number of precious lessons for us in this book. And the first lesson I really want us to focus on is that, when you feel at your lowest, talk to God. Talk to God about how you're feeling, because that's exactly what Job does. It's not something that's really mentioned much amongst churches. How do we cope when we feel depressed, or when you don't even want to live any longer, which is what Job experiences? He never cursed God, but he still felt utter despair. And he even wished that he had never been born. Let's take a look at some of his comments. Maybe, some of us can relate to some of these. In Job chapter 3, verse 11, he says, why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Job 7, verses 15 and 16. I prefer strangling and death rather than this body of mine. Remember, he was covered in sores, in ulcers, he was in pain. He said, I despise my life. I would not live forever. Let me alone. My days have no meaning. Job 10, verse 1. I loathe my very life. Therefore I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out in the bitterness of my soul. Job 17 verse 1. My spirit is broken. My days are cut short. The grave awaits me. And one more, Job 30 verse 15. Terrors overwhelm me. My dignity is driven away as by the wind. My safety vanishes like a cloud. He was one depressed man, contending with the overwhelming sense of loss, suffering, and pain. He talked about how he felt. He poured out his complaint and lament. He was honest about how he felt, and his emotions were raw. He poured out his complaint before God, laying bare his internal struggle and his quest to learn why he was going through this torment. But you know what is interesting? You know that God, later on in the book, does not condemn Job for pouring out his heart, for complaining, for his lament. He doesn't condemn him for that. He doesn't judge him for that. He doesn't rebuke Job for his words of despair and lament. It's allowed. It's okay to tell God how you're feeling. He's big enough. He loves you enough. He's listening and he cares. And all that Job wanted through this all he wanted was an opportunity to speak with God. He just wanted an opportunity to come before God, to appear with God and argue his case. We see that. Job 13 verse 3, he said, but I desire to speak to the Almighty and to argue my case with God. Job 10 verse 2, I say to God, do not declare me guilty, but tell me what charges you have against me. And then Job 23, let's look at one more from verse 3. Job says, if only I knew where to find him, if only I could go to his dwelling, I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what he would answer me and consider what he would say to me. Would he vigorously oppose me? No. He would not press charges against me. There the upright can establish their innocence before him, and there I would be delivered forever from my judge. Job has confidence, even later on in chapter 23, that if only he had the chance to appear before God and argue his case, that God would vindicate him, God would set him free from his suffering. Even then, his confidence in God's character was steadfast and firm. And all he wanted to do was to speak with God, because he believed that God would vindicate him. He believed that God was a just God and that God would deliver him. And so it seems that despite his tremendous suffering, tremendous losses, that Job is as confident in God's good character as God is in Job's character. And we know that God does indeed give Job what he asks for, a meeting with him. But when God has spoken about his interest and his care for his creation in the final chapters, Job found that his mouth was no longer full of arguments. He humbly bows before God, who has explained in great length how much he intimately cares and takes interest in his creation. And so if you're feeling depressed, if you're going through a very difficult situation in your life, maybe some kind of loss or suffering or pain, do what Job did. Pour out your heart before God. He cares for you. The book of Job makes that clear. He's interested in his creation. He will listen to you, and he will ultimately answer your prayer. So tell God how you feel. The second lesson for us is that, as I've already sort of mentioned, God intimately knows and cares for his creation, including you and I. What's interesting in this book is that, God doesn't actually tell Job of the heavenly dialogue that went on in chapter 1. So Job doesn't know about that conversation with God and Satan, but he does understand that he's being tested. He says that in chapter 23, verse 10. He says, talking about God, he says, he knows the way that I take, and when he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. So even though he doesn't know about the conversation that went on, he does understand that God is testing him. And so God does answer his prayers, like I've mentioned, and he does appear before Job out of the whirlwind. We see that from chapters 38 to 41. And so how does God respond to Job? Well, like I just briefly mentioned, he explains to Job about his intimate knowledge of and care for his creation and his interest in it. God describes the grandeur of the universe, which he created. He describes the complexities of nature and the marvels of the animal kingdom that he created, which all highlight his wisdom, sovereignty, and care over us all. In these closing chapters, God emphasizes his control over creation and his provision to all living things. He speaks about the constellations. He talks about how he walks in the depths of the sea. He talks about how he watches the mountain goats give birth. He talks about his control over the wild oxen. He talks about his care for the ostrich's eggs, showing his intimate interest and knowledge of his creation. And of course, this revelation is meant to comfort Job and comfort us, to show us that the same God who cares for the cosmos and his creation cares for you and I. Let's look at some of these comments that God said to Job. Job 38, verse 22. Have you entered the storehouses of snow, or seen the storehouses of hail, which I reserve for times of trouble, for days of war and battle? Verse 25. Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm, to water a land where no one lives, an uninhabited desert, to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass? Verse 39. Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in a thicket? Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food? Job 39, verse 1. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you count the months till they bear? Verse 5. Who let the wild donkey go free? Who untied its ropes? I gave it the wasteland for its home, the salt flats as its habitat. When you read these verses, you are certainly left with a strong impression of how much God cares for his creation. He does not forget us. He is not distant. He is not uncaring, as we might be tempted to think, as seasons of suffering might tempt us to think this. But God is not uncaring. God is caring. God knows, and he loves his creation. And so because of these facts, we can approach God just like Job did. And we can have confidence in God when we go through our trials and our seasons of suffering. Because God is the God of all comfort, who hears us and helps us and answers us when we go through our trials. Let's look at a few Bible verses that talk about this wonderful fact. Psalm 23, verse 4. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, certainly that was Job's experience, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, and your rod and your staff, they comfort me. 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3 and 4. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort that we ourselves receive from God. John 14, verses 16 and 17. Jesus says, I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. Maybe like Job, you might feel that you wish you had never been born. You feel that the grave just awaits you, and you feel the utter despair of your situation. But this book of Job is meant to give us hope. It's meant to show us how much God does indeed care. It's meant to show us that God answers prayer. None of us have experienced, I would imagine, the depths of losses that Job experienced. None of us have suffered to his degree, but God answered him. And God was very confident that Job would maintain his fear of God. And he does. Although Job feels utter despair and vents his feelings and his emotions and his complaint to those around him, at no point did Job curse God. He maintained his faith and trust and confidence in God's good character. And listen to what God says about Job to his friends. This is what God says about Job. Job 42 verse 7. He says, "My anger burns against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." I love that. God vindicates Job before his friends who had no confidence in his integrity or the words that he was saying, maintaining his innocence. They were not a help at all, but God vindicates Job's integrity, Job's character before his friends. And so if we will maintain a right attitude before God, trusting him through the storms that Satan throws at us, God will deliver us and God will answer our prayers, just like he did for Job. And let's not forget what God did for Job. He reinstates him and he gives him twice as much as he had before in terms of wealth. He rebukes Job's friends, his useless comforters, and affirms Job's integrity before them, like I just said. He restores him. He gives him another 10 children, 7 sons, 3 more daughters. And it says that his 3 daughters were the most beautiful women in the land. And he gives him twice as much as he had before, twice as much cattle, etc. So he's twice as wealthy as he started off with. And it ends, he said he lives many more years after these events. I think it was 140, and he saw his children to the 4th generation. So he had a wonderful long life at the end of it all. And so let's be comforted by the book of Job. Yes, Satan works to steal, kill and destroy, but God is sovereign. Don't curse God, don't blame God, trust God, wait for God. Maybe your faith is tested like Job's was, but God will come through for you. He will come through for you. Don't doubt that. And he will deliver you from your situation. As Philippians 4 verses 6 and 7 says, I've mentioned this verse before, don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And so, no, God is sovereign. He intimately knows his creation, including you. He cares for his creation, and he will answer you. He is faithful. God had tremendous confidence in Job's faith in him, and Job had tremendous confidence in God. Let's be inspired by Job. Let's put all our confidence in God. Let's put all our trust in God and pour out your heart before him, and he will answer you.
The land of my fathers, the